So Olga, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll just go straight to my presentation. Just a second. Okay, well, you should now see my shared screen. Is that right? Yep. Okay, all good. So today I wanted to present results of our review of the URM fund, which was established to assist building owners with securing facades and parapets as part of the order in council after Kaikōura earthquakes. And this was part of the bigger review that MB has commissioned at the end of last year. And we kind of joined that review quite late in the process, and they have, although they originally really wanted QuakeCoRE to do the whole review, but you know, it was kind of short notice, and eventually Martin Jenkins took the biggest chunk of this review, and engineering was done by somebody else as well. So we have specifically just looked at the URM fund, and Jason and I were involved in this. So when the Kaikōura earthquake struck New Zealand on the 14th of November 2016, it really, I guess, reminded all of us of what happened in the Christchurch earthquakes, and especially in the 2011 earthquake, when you had 39 people dying and 110 people being injured just from the falling URM elements from the buildings and dying. These people dying on the streets, and of course there was a big Royal Commission inquiry into why these failures have happened. So we did kind of have a lot of knowledge and recent examples of what fallen URM buildings can do to public. And this kind of strengthened the response of the government in terms of what we need to do after the Kaikōura earthquakes. There was also advice coming from GNS that certainly there is heightened seismicity, at least for the next 12 months, and especially affecting URM buildings. And just after 1 month after these earthquakes, two engineering societies, and that is New Zealand Society for Earthquake Engineering and Structural Engineering Society, wrote a submission to the then building minister Nick Smith that they're really concerned for public safety during this time after Kaikōura earthquakes. And our kind of these URM buildings, obviously there is quite high concentrations of them in central areas of the city where there's of course a lot of public walking on the streets and so on. So clearly the government had to respond to these kind of concerns for life safety. And their response was the Hurunui Kaikōura Earthquakes Recovery Order, specifically for unreinforced masonry buildings, which was enacted on February 28, 2017, and it specifically applied to 4 territorial authorities where the kind of GNS predicted that the highest seismic activity after the earthquakes would be kind of concentrated in the upper South Island and lower North Island. So it was specifically these 4 territorial authorities, Wellington, Lower Hutt, Hurunui, and Marlborough, that were affected by this order. And this order was targeting required securing of unreinforced masonry facades and parapets within 12 months. Within the order, there was some of the provisions within the Building Act 2004 were modified, and namely, they created a new class of dangerous buildings, and that is the street-facing unreinforced masonry building. They also removed the requirement for building consent, And they also allowed these 4 territorial authorities to issue Section 124 notices under the Building Act of 2004 to require securing facades and parapets within 12 months. So councils were given 1 month essentially from February 28th to issue these Section 124 notices to building owners, and within the order there was a list of 38 streets that were identified to be where there's a lot of high concentrations of public around those buildings, so streets with high foot traffic or perhaps some kind of local routes or routes that used by emergency services. So they've identified 38 streets, and if building owners fail to comply with the 12-month deadline, the councils could impose a $200,000 fine on those building owners. So that was kind of for if you don't comply, but at the same time they were dangling a carrot to building owners. So they have established the URM securing fund, which was for $4.5 million, and $3 million came from the government, and $1.5 million was matched from the 4 affected councils. In the end, I mean, there were some amendments to this fund, but at the end, the funding was capped at $25,000 for buildings up to 2 stories and $65,000 for buildings that are 3 or 4 stories. And for buildings that had 2 facades facing the streets, so corner buildings, then that capped amount was doubled to $50,000 or $130,000. So clearly, after about the first 9 months into the program, the government and the council saw that a lot of building owners were dragging their feet, but it wasn't only just because of the building owners dragging their feet. There was some other practical constraints, and that is kind of an unintended consequence of this legislation where the requirement for the building consent was removed. Actually, a lot of engineers were quite reluctant to take on the work of designing securing solutions for these buildings because they were worried of the potential liability that would come out of that. So a lot of smaller firms especially just didn't want to touch these buildings. And especially, of course, after Kaikōura earthquakes, there was a lot of resources that was diverted for the targeted damage evaluation program, and there was a lot of new project happening in Wellington at the same time. So clearly some engineers felt that, well, it's much easier for me to work on new projects rather than take on these complex unreinforced masonry buildings. So that also kind of dragged out the whole process of securing. And so the government said that after the first 10 months or so, they decided to extend the order. And so they were given a 6-month extension to September 2018 for the building owners to complete the work. So within our kind of work with Jason, we're looking just at the URM securing fund, and we wanted to find out like at what speed the notices were issued, how many buildings actually had to be secured, and how much in the end, how much money from the fund was spent to secure these buildings. So the councils, collectively, the 4 councils have issued 189 notices, although original estimates were putting that to be around 300 buildings would be affected. So eventually Wellington City Council issued the most notices, 113 within the city, 72 in Hutt City, and 2 each within Marlborough and Hurunui. If you look at the speed at which the councils were issuing the notices, Hutt City was the first one to issue all of them on the same day. So all 70 notices went out on the 10th of March, whereas Wellington City Council kind of took a more staggered approach, and they were issuing notices throughout the month of March. Although, you know, we had quite a few I mean, first of all, most of the notices were issued between Wellington City Council and Hutt City Councils, but even within those two territorial authorities, there were kind of hotspots of where the notices were issued, and 2/3 of all of the notices within Wellington were really concentrated within Te Aro and Newtown, and within Lower Hutt, 86% of the notices were issued between the Jackson Street area in Petone and in the central area of Lower Hutt in High Street. That's where another big chunk of notices was issued. If we look at the building characteristics, of course, we're dealing with unreinforced masonry buildings which were built in the early last century, and therefore a lot of them are deemed to be heritage buildings. So in Wellington and Lower Hutt, most of the buildings that had notices issued to them were heritage buildings. And looking at the distribution of stories within the buildings, you had 1- and 2-story buildings. Of course, they were the majority of the buildings with those section 1 to 4 notices, and of course all of the kind of more complex and larger buildings, they were all concentrated within Wellington. And Marlborough did have one in Blenheim. They had 1 4-story building in there as well, but it wasn't, I guess, the facade of this building in Marlborough wasn't as complex as the buildings in Wellington. It was quite plain. So when the councils issued the notices to building owners, out of these 189 notices, 70 of those notices, actually, it's been discovered that these buildings didn't need to be secured. And so throughout the first 12 months, really, these 70 notices were lifted from the building owners. And the most interestingly, the most common reason for why these notices were lifted is that because either the facade or the parapet of the building actually didn't have URM elements on it. So even though it looked like a URM building, when you actually do some more invasive testing, a lot of them might have had some timber framing behind or some other elements that they weren't strictly then falling into the category that were defined by the order. Then some of the buildings were already strengthened. Some of the buildings weren't earthquake prone. Those, not the buildings, but at least the elements, the facades and parapets, and the councils did further investigations to find out that the buildings didn't require actually securing under the order. So you can see that out of 72 notices within Lower Hutt, 47 notices were lifted that they did not require securing. And as it turned out, actually in Lower Hutt, their local council, there was a building fire within the council, and they lost a lot of building records. And so it was really a lot of time, I guess, for quite a few buildings. The council had to guess whether the building would be affected by the order. And as it turns out, because, well, they didn't have such good records as, I would say, Wellington City Council, you know, it turned out that only 25 buildings in Lower Hutt had to be strengthened, secured, the facades or parapets. In Wellington, I would say, because they had such good program early on, and since 2006, their council has been looking at earthquake-prone buildings, and you can see that the results clearly, they know a lot, have a much better control over understanding of what kind of building stock they have within their council. And so a much smaller percentage out of the total notices that were issued in Wellington were actually lifted because they didn't need securing. And that is, I guess, thanks to all of the work that they've been doing in the past. And of course, many of the buildings that received these section 1 to 4 notices would have already known that they are under the gun, that they would be affected by this order, because out of the buildings, out of the 113 buildings that received notices in the Wellington City Council, you can see on this graph that quite a few of them already had existing Section 1 to 4 notices that required them to strengthen their full strengthening of the building. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise to them to receive that S1 to 4 notice. So after removing those 70 buildings from the list of a total 189, we were left with 119 buildings that needed to be secured. And as I said before, you know, about 10 months into the program, towards the end of 2017, MB and the councils kind of realized that a lot of the owners were either dragging their feet, and about 2/3 of the notices that were still outstanding, they knew that building owners wouldn't be able to meet the 12-month deadline. Some of them didn't even start any work on the buildings at all. So there was no way that they would finish in the last 2 months, that they would be able to finish the work and apply for funding. And so council were kind of, for the first at least half of the program, they were kind of took a light touch approach to the building owners, where they issued the notices and they were then just waiting for the building owners to come up with the goods. So they saw that this doesn't really work, and perhaps we had this a lot of building owners had the perception that, well, what is council going to do? There's been so many regulations in the past where I really didn't have any consequences of not complying. So they felt that this thing is just going to go away. And building owners decided, well, they just felt they didn't really need to do anything. But I think the government really wanted to set the tone with this program. They really wanted to kind of show them that if you don't comply, you are going to suffer the consequences. There was this $200,000 fine for potential non-compliance. So they have kind of, the council started to intensify their work with the building owners, and they switched from this light touch to kind of more case management and working closely with all of the building owners to try to get them over the line. And kind of to help a lot of the smaller owners of smaller buildings, that, you know, they are not really so well familiar with how to even engage an engineer and what this whole thing entails and how long it's going to take. So many building owners were kind of lost. And because of that, Wellington City Council actually contracted RCP, a firm that is based in Christchurch, to offer project management to smaller buildings within the area. And also within Lower Hutt, there kind of emerged a community effort within Jackson Street. Owners hired Hampton Jones to do kind of a lot of work for the buildings within the area. So there's certainly some initiatives that came out as a result of the program. It's either was community-led, like in Lower Hutt, or more council-led, as in Wellington City. But in general, if you look at the timeline, February 2018 was the original deadline when all of the work had to be completed. But even in February 2018, still 118 active S1 Section 1 to 4 notices were there out of 189. So that's quite a high number. And clearly the government realized that we need to give an extension to building owners. So out of the 119 buildings that needed to be secured, I would say that overall the program was really successful, because 118 buildings were secured and only one building still remains, it's cordoned off at the moment in Hurunui. That building still is not secured, but 118, that is quite a good achievement, I would say. Only 4 buildings were demolished as the result of this program, and 112 building owners were 112 building owners managed to complete all of the securing by the end of the deadline, which was the extended deadline of September 2018. Only 2 building owners kind of missed out on the funding, so you had to complete all of your securing by September 2018 to qualify for the contribution from the URM fund. So 2 building owners missed out on that, but they still completed the securing. So if you look at the speed at which notices were lifted from these buildings that had to be secured, you can see that there was a huge push from the Wellington City Council to get the building owners to comply and complete all of the work within the required deadline. There is a few notices that were lifted after September, but there was, and all of them were from Lower Hutt, but they still received funding because I think it was just a timing of processing the applications by MB, but the actual securing work was completed by the end of September 2018. From this list of 119 buildings that had to be secured, 104 building owners received actual contributions from the URM fund. Out of this 104, only 4 building owners, even though, 4 building owners received contribution only for the engineering assessments. And this is because some of them started with, they were thinking, well, I'm going to design a securing solution for my building, but then later on down the track, they decided that no, it's just too complicated and I'm better off just demolishing the building. So those 2 building owners who decided to demolish, they still got contributions for the engineering solutions that they had for their buildings to secure them, even though they demolished. And then because 2 buildings missed out on the securing deadline, they only received contributions for their engineering design. And for another 14 building owners from this list of 119, they did secure their buildings, but they did not claim funds from the URM fund. So another 2 of those buildings were just demolished, so that's why they didn't ask for anything. And 9 buildings were in the process of being strengthened, and perhaps they just didn't want to bother with, I really don't know why they didn't ask for funding, but 2 of those buildings were, 2 of the buildings are still actually being strengthened, and that's the buildings that are owned by Wellington City Council, and that's the Town Hall and St. James Theatre. So as I said before, that the councils and MB realized that building owners taking longer than needed, and from February 2018, Wellington City Council actually kind of negotiated with MB where they take over case management of smaller buildings. So all of the 1- and 2-story buildings then went under Wellington City Council, and MB still was reviewing applications for kind of larger and complex buildings that were 3 or 4 stories. So in the end, the total money that was spent from the URM securing fund was just over $3 million. And that is from the total of $4.5 million that they've committed. So there was still an underspend of nearly $1.5 million. So we look kind of in more detail on where that money was spent. We can see that the biggest chunk of the URM fund went to the Wellington City Council. So 2.5 million from 3 million went to the Wellington City Council. But in terms of the total cost that the building owners had to spend on securing, again, Wellington City Council was the winner in there. So 8.6 million out of 9.7 million that the building owners have spent in total on securing with across the 4 territorial authorities. I mean, overall, I mean, is it, I would say, I guess, what this 10 million was able to achieve is that we've secured buildings in areas that there is a lot of public, and so we're protecting lives of kind of New Zealand public at a cost of 10 million. So of course, not all building owners were able to keep the costs within the capped amount, and so 43 buildings out of the 104 that received funding exceeded the cap. And so the initial $4.5 million.
Olga,
yep.
Olga, you need to wrap up in a few minutes.
Yep.
Because
yes, I'm almost at the end.
Because I want to leave time for questions.
Yep. So if we look at the buildings that exceeded the cap, it was clear that the highest variation in costs were for kind of more complex buildings that were over 2 stories. And that is kind of expected that these taller buildings, they would need some more kind of expensive and tailored solutions for them. Also, the original caps were calculated with kind of typical building, which they thought that 8 meters is a typical URM building, so 8 meters of the length of the building that is facing the street. But in fact, when we went out and measured the actual kind of widths of the buildings that face the street, the typical width was around 20 meters. So the 8-meter typical width that they thought originally, in fact, was for many cases the minimum width. So again, this is another area why the building owners exceeded the caps in those cases. And if just in looking at the average cost spent per meter of the building, you can see that as the building gets higher in terms of as buildings get taller, obviously you spend more money to secure it. So in summary, the order was quite resource intensive to implement. So councils had to divert a lot of their human resources to deal with these building owners and managing the program. But it is, I would say, the flexibility and adaptability of the councils and MB that contributed to the success of the program. I mean, out of 189 notices, all of them were lifted except a single outstanding notice. I would say within the 18 months, it's quite a mammoth effort to complete. I would say there was the right mix of incentives and penalties, and these incentives pushed owners towards compliance. And as I said, the government really wanted to set the tone with this program because, of course, we have a much bigger program in front of us, and that's the strengthening of earthquake-prone buildings. So yes, that is it from me. Happy to take your questions.
Questions? Anybody? Please chime in if you have any questions. We have some people who joined the call later on. Apparently there was some technical difficulties.
That was really, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can, Bridget.
Good, hello. That's really, really interesting, and obviously a huge piece of work that you have conducted there. I was wondering, those buildings that got some support, and you said that they got some funds for engineering design, but then they're still demolished.
Yeah.
To discourage that behaviour in the future, is that needed to have some penalties if they go so far, or is there an ability to exit out of that at some point? Because it seems that the resources are very tight and scarce going forward with the future scale of this. So I just wonder about setting a precedent with that kind of behaviour.
I mean, that behavior wasn't widespread. As you can see, out of 189, only 4 demolished. So it's a very small percentage. And even though demolishing a building, because there were non-heritage buildings within buildings that had these notices, and they could demolish, but they still chose to strengthen. So I would say, I wouldn't say that this behavior was quite widespread, and I think there's still majority building owners want to keep these buildings. And demolition is quite expensive, to be honest. So I don't think it's something that a lot of building owners want to get into.
Maybe I could add, demolition is not necessarily a bad outcome. It could potentially be a good outcome. I mean, unless it's a heritage building, it's a heritage building, then maybe everyone is better off if the building is demolished.
Yeah.
And if the subsidy pushed the owner to go in that direction, then maybe it's a good thing. Oh.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Sure. Thank you, Olga. Really interesting. Is a couple of things about sort of sharing this knowledge, so we know this is recorded. Is the NB report a public document? Is there a...
Not yet. You know, we have completed this work at the end of February, and then it was going to go for review to the minister and so on. And obviously we had this big thing happening there. Focus has shifted. So there is no public report yet.
So that's the intention to release it.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely the intention.
And then obviously, I'm sure are you planning a paper or something summarizing this?
Yeah, definitely. I would like to, yes.
So watch this space. Look forward to maybe when the report is public, because you might find out ahead of us.
Yeah.
You let us know and share that.
Definitely, yeah.
And because I think there are many issues in this, and I think from future QuakeCoRE research taking different lines. So I'm particularly interested in the behavioral aspects, what motivates people. I'm also interested in the relationship between, because I worked a lot with Bax in Wellington, and he shared with me his both frustrations and joys about the challenges and opportunities and the good and the bad in the process of doing this. So I think that will spark a whole lot of further opportunities to really ask those hard questions about how do we strengthen existing, how to reduce the earthquake risk to our existing building stock, and what are the challenges and opportunities. So it would be nice to draw on this work appropriately in due course, as opposed to a PERS-COM off a video recording. So look forward to seeing it out there. But I think, and it does resonate with some of the discussions, obviously talking with some of the MB folk about small town New Zealand and the challenges they face with some of their earthquake strengthening program. And I think that then in the for those who weren't there, the pre-conversation about what is the future for earthquake strengthening during our upcoming depression, when there are other things at play, and maybe that's where the opportunity is of public investment in rebuilding communities for economic growth. Maybe this becomes a strengthening, this becomes an opportunity for some of those work schemes. Yeah. So, and that really comes on some other narratives around alternative pathways for social economic recovery from coming out from the arts or heritage sectors, as opposed to the sort of traditional, or what we saw out of Canterbury about the economy-led recovery, as opposed to some more aspects. So that may then open further opportunities from a slightly different perspective going forward.
Yeah.
So,
no, I think, especially for smaller town, there is more of an argument for public funding and the public good value of these old buildings in those areas.
And we've just been having a discussion about the case of Dunedin in this context, actually, and the work you've done really paves the way for showing how these policies might be implemented, and as David said, the challenges and opportunities in amongst that. And I think the biggest problem for Dunedin and other towns in relatively low seismic hazard zones is a 35-year time frame, and there's just no incentive. As you said, these building owners just hope it's going to go away, and the council hopes this whole thing's going to go away, but of course it's not. But how do you motivate action when even in Wellington it took a close call with the Kaikōura earthquake to stimulate this policy, the stick coming out to get these building owners to do the work? How do we tackle this in these other cities? It's really tough.
Well, I think, it's good that they kind of wanted they were prepared to be tough with building owners, and even some papers coming out of MB that yes, we are going to take kind of, if buildings owners don't comply, there is going to be consequences. And I think the short time frame that they've imposed on building owners, that also helped. You know, the timeline of 35 years doesn't really help with incentivizing people to do anything. But
Olga, before we wrap up, I have a lot of questions, but
we can stay. I don't mind staying.
Yeah. No, but we need to sort of, we can continue this conversation later on. But did you try to assess any of the sort of more critically assess the program? For example, the 70 buildings that were taken off the list.
Yeah.
Are they really safe? Or are they just not exactly according to the criteria used in the order of council, and because of that the councils backed off them because they realized that legally they can't enforce it? But so, you know, because there is a distinction. Do they apply in the, do they fit the criteria, or are they safe? So were they removed because they did not fit the criteria, or because they are really safe? That's one question.
I think
and, you know, you're not the engineer, Jason.
No, I'm not.
But did you attempt to evaluate that at all?
No,
the other question
within,
has to. No, the other question is within the money. I saw the spreadsheet that was given to Stacy by council included a lot. Much more money for some buildings than the caps.
Yes.
So I'm not sure what's going on, because your numbers suggested the average building got about 30,000. And the spreadsheet that I saw from Stacy had some buildings getting more than 200,000. So I don't know what's going on. But is there some kind of an accounting issue where some money was given to owners through some other fund rather than through this URM fund or something like that?
Well, I have not done a forensic accounting with Wellington City Council, but I have seen their spreadsheet, and in some areas there were discrepancies. I agree. I think Wellington City Council had a bit more freedom in terms of how they allocated funding. They weren't as tied up as MB, I would say. In some cases, I think Wellington City Council have spent more, given more funding, but they also had redirected some of their heritage fund into this program. So perhaps this is the money from that they.
So the 3 million that you're quoting might not be actually the amount spent on this program. It might underestimate the amount spent on this program.
That is the money that's spent specifically from the URM fund.
Yes, I understand.
Yes.
But the overall strengthening of these 104 buildings was achieved potentially with more funding coming from other sources.
Maybe another 500,000 tops, but I wouldn't think it's more than that.
Sure.
I mean, there was a few buildings that were doing heritage equip as well, so they were doing full strengthening, but there was no double dipping, I know that. So whatever, if they got some money from the URM fund, then heritage equip just deducted that amount from their funding.
Sure.
I wonder how secure projects like this and funding are in relation to the economic spiral we seem to be going into now. The priorities might be shifting and changing due to far less resources being available. It's no doubt these projects are incredibly important, and especially the safety component.
Yeah.
But David's point was actually that there's a lot more funding now available. The government announced the biggest stimulus in its history, I think. So there is potentially a lot of funding available. Where it will go, we don't know.
Yes, exactly.
Fully, but it's not as though we are now in a scarce funding environment. It's just where the money will be spent, and whether this might be, as David suggested, a good way to spend some of this money.
Well, we just had an announcement from the Vice-Chancellor here at Auckland yesterday. I don't know if Olga was in on that call. There was 3,500 people in on that call. And from the funding point of view, it's looking pretty grim in terms of what they're starting to think about in terms of protecting fixed-term jobs, what they're prepared to change and sacrifice. And so it's interesting times, for sure, as to how they prioritise things.
I think it's time for us to end this. So if you could virtually, while mute or unmute, express your appreciation to Olga for her very interesting project, and we hope to see the papers and the reports and actually follow up, because I think this is a very interesting. It provides us a lot of things to think about for future programs like this in other places.
No, definitely it
New
shows
Zealand.
a lot what we can achieve in short time frame.
So thank you very much, and see you all soon.
Okay, bye.
Thank you all for coming.